Let me ask you an uncomfortable question right away. How many times have you moved on thinking it was into your problem? Henry Turner thought the same. In less than a minute, he made a wrong decision that seemed small, almost irrelevant. There were no screams, no immediate tragedy, no punishment. Just silence. Just a poorly made choice he believed time would erase. What Henry didn't know is that some emotional decisions, when disguised as rational decisions, don't fade. They wait, and when they return, they bring a weight on the conscience capable of changing who you are inside. This isn't a story about a bad person. Quite the opposite. It's about an ordinary individual with good intentions who believed not acting was neutral. Here, you'll understand why doing nothing is also a choice and why the heaviest regret doesn't come from what we did, but from what we avoided doing when we had the chance. Life rarely warns us when it's testing us. Sometimes, it simply watches what you do when no one else is looking. What if I told you this story isn't about Henry, but about the next crossroads in your own life? A simple, seemingly trivial moment that can define years of guilt or peace. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to hear may prevent you from carrying a silent mistake for the rest of your life. Some decisions last seconds. The consequences, a lifetime. Henry Turner was walking briskly that afternoon through a typical American city, perhaps Chicago or Boston, where the cold wind seems to speak to those passing by on the sidewalk. He was absorbed in his own commitments, his tight schedule. That familiar feeling that time is always slipping through his fingers. Then something broke the ordinary rhythm of the street, almost like a whisper asking for empathy. A boy was sitting on the curb, his knee bleeding, his backpack tossed beside him, his eyes full of fear and confusion. There were no sirens, no screams, no audience. Who's the simply human scene one of those moments that tests the respect someone has for another person's life? Henry slowed his pace, quickly assessed the situation, and felt the first internal push between a rational decision and an emotional decision, without yet realizing the weight on his conscience that was beginning to form. In that brief instant, Henry reasoned the way so many do. He thought someone more prepared would help, that the neighborhood was full of adults, that the boy didn't seem to be in extreme danger. It was the mind searching for justifications for a poorly made choice, even though it seemed logical. The clock mattered. The commitment mattered. Being late would be inconvenient. What was missing there was the compassion that ISNT taught in books, but practiced in everyday life. He kept walking, telling himself it wasn't a wrong decision, just a neutral one. But neutrality also carries choice, and choice always carries consequence. As Henry walked away, the boy remained small before the world, invisible to someone who could have changed everything with a simple gesture. A phone call, a bit of affection and kindness. As a mentor observing life from the outside, it's impossible not to notice how seemingly trivial decisions shape entire destinies. Henry wasn't a bad man, far from it. He simply underestimated the power of kindness in that specific moment. Many would have done the same, and that's where the silent trap of regret lies. A simple, "Are you okay?" could have been reconciliation with his own humanity. A simple "I'll call someone" could have prevented a future weight on his conscience. In the United States, where urgency dictates the rhythm of cities, encounters like this happen every day, testing the practical wisdom of ordinary people. And as Henry disappeared into the crowd, something invisible settled inside him, a seed that would later sprout into emotional turmoil and painful inspiration, preparing the ground for what was still to come, even though he didn't yet know it. Henry Turner took a few more steps, and with each meter of distance, he felt a slight discomfort, almost like an ache, deep in his chest. It wasn't pain, it was something more subtle, a quiet warning from his conscience, asking for understanding. Still, he smothered that feeling with rational arguments. He told himself it wasn't his responsibility, that the city had public services, that someone more qualified would show up. This attempt to turn an emotional decision into a rational decision seemed smart at the time. After all, doing nothing felt safer than getting involved. But without realizing it, Henry had just cemented a wrong decision, disguised as logic. The weight on his conscience was still light, almost imperceptible, but it was already walking beside him. Each step forward didn't just increase the physical distance, it increased the moral distance as well. Henry blended into the crowd, the noise of cars, the flow of hurried people, believing the problem would be left behind. This was the poorly made choice many make when they confuse silence with innocence. Not helping seemed neutral, harmless, almost invisible. Yet omission is also action. Even if it doesn't stain the hands, the boy remained there, vulnerable, dependent on luck, while Henry moved on, believing he had done what was most convenient. What was missing was practical love, the kind that shows up in simple actions, without grand speeches. What was missing was kindness applied in the real world. From the perspective of someone who observes the story with wisdom, it becomes clear how quick decisions shape long trajectories. Henry didn't reflect deeply, didn't weigh consequences, didn't imagine outcomes. He simply chose to move on. And that's how regret is usually born, not from great tragedies, but from small deviations from empathy. Many believe that making a mistake means doing something bad, when in truth, making a mistake can also mean not acting when you could. That silent choice began tying the fate of two strangers together in an irreversible way. And while Henry believed the episode had ended there, life was already preparing the next chapter, where the absence of a correct decision would begin to demand its price in an unexpected way. Minutes later, the boy tried to stand up on his own, putting his weight on a leg that trembled with pain. Blood slowly ran down, and confusion took over the young mind, still trying to understand what had happened. Without guidance, without an adult nearby, he made an emotional decision, driven by fear and the childlike urgency to find help. He looked around, took a deep breath, and headed toward a busier street, believing someone would see him there. It was an act of survival, not a conscious choice. What was missing was the empathy of someone who could have prevented this next step. What seemed like just a scraped knee began to take on more serious dimensions as the world moved on indifferently. Without basic care, the wound worsened quickly. The boy touched the injury with dirty hands, trying to ease the pain, unaware he was making everything worse. The poorly made choice wasn't his, but the consequences fell on his fragile body. Instead of sitting and waiting, he walked more than he should have, entered unsafe places, exposed himself to risk. Hours later, infection had already set in, turning something simple into a medical emergency. What could have been solved with a phone call to emergency services, some water, a clean cloth, and compassion, became a serious problem. The absence of early help showed how omission is also a wrong decision, even when it doesn't look like one. When he finally arrived at a hospital, taken there by strangers who noticed him too late, his condition was already delicate. Doctors rushed, nurses acted, and protocols were activated. All of it could have been avoided with a simple gesture, one that costs neither money nor too much time. From the standpoint of wisdom, this sequence proves how a small human failure can trigger major consequences. Henry never saw this part of the story, but it began exactly at the moment he chose to move on. Regret still had no face for him, but the weight on his conscience was already being shaped, even from afar. And while the boy fought to recover, life prepared the moment when Henry would begin to understand that doing nothing also transforms destinies, quietly opening the path to the next chapter of this story. Meanwhile, Henry Turner continued with the script of his day as if nothing had happened. He arrived at his appointment, handled pending issues, talked with colleagues, laughed at trivial comments. The human mind has a curious ability to protect its own image, pushing discomfort into a quiet corner of consciousness. The absence of immediate consequences reinforced the idea that the wrong decision might not have been so wrong after all. After all, nothing had gone wrong for him. This apparent calm seemed to confirm that the poorly made choice would have no cost. The weight on his conscience still slept, lulled by distractions and urgent tasks. As the hours passed, the episode dissolved among emails, meetings, and the ordinary commitments of adult life in the United States. Henry didn't see himself as lacking empathy. On the contrary, he had always considered himself a decent person. That was precisely why his mind built such convincing justifications. Someone helped. It didn't seem serious. I'm not a doctor. Everything sounded like a rational decision. Yet behind those phrases was a lack of compassion that requires no specialization, only love that acts doesn't wait for absolute certainty. It responds to the human moment. Henry kept believing he had done the best he could under the circumstances, unaware that this internal narrative was only a temporary anesthetic. The problem with wrong decisions is that they rarely demand payment right away. Life often gives a pause, a strategic silence that confuses even the most attentive. That pause creates the illusion of correctness when, in reality, it's just a delay. As a mentor observing the story with wisdom, it's clear that regret usually arrives when there's no turning back. Henry's false calm was the perfect ground for a deeper fall, because he hadn't yet connected the dots. The story seemed finished, but it was merely stored away, waiting for the exact moment to resurface. And that moment, silent and inevitable, was already beginning to approach along the edges of reality. Days later, on an ordinary morning, Henry Turner sat with a cup of coffee in front of the television, tuned to a local news broadcast. It was one of those typical American morning shows, with quick updates and human interest stories between weather forecasts. Then a report caught his attention. A boy had been injured near a familiar street at the same time, in the same neighborhood. The description landed like a silent blow. Injured knee, backpack on the ground, confusion, fear. The coffee grew cold in Henry's hand as the weight on his conscience fully awakened. That wrong decision, once abstract now, had a face, a voice, a story. The empathy he had postponed returned with full force. What once seemed like coincidence began to feel personal. Henry's mind tried to resist, to find loopholes, to deny connections. It could be another boy. These things happen all the time. But truth doesn't stay silent. The poorly made choice moved from hypothesis into emotional responsibility. It didn't matter whether someone else helped later. What mattered was that he had the chance and made another choice. What had seemed like a rational decision now revealed itself as deeply emotional, built more on comfort than compassion. Regret began to take shape not as an explosion, but as a constant tightness in his chest. In that moment, Henry understood something few realize early in life. Some decisions only reveal their impact when they can no longer be corrected. Wisdom often arrives late when we ignore the small calls of conscience. He wasn't responsible for the accident itself, but he was part of the story that preceded the outcome. The love he failed to practice that day returned now as an internal charge. Reconciliation with himself felt distant, and as Henry stared at the dark screen in silence, something inside him shifted irreversibly, preparing the ground for an even deeper conflict, a kind no one sees, but that defines who a person becomes from that point on. From that day on, Henry Turner found no mental rest. The image of the boy didn't appear as a clear scene, but in fragments: a bleeding knee here, a backpack tossed there, a look he pretended not to see. The silence that once felt comforting turned into a constant noise inside his head. The wrong decision began repeating itself like an unfinished sentence, echoing at random moments: drafting, the shower, before sleep. He realized that regret doesn't shout, it whispers. Non-stop, the weight on his conscience settled firmly, stealing the lightness from simple things. What had been a poorly made choice of seconds began to charge hours, days, entire nights of restlessness. Henry began suffering consequences no one around him could name. His patience wore thin. His focus slipped. Pleasure in small achievements disappeared. He tried to rationalize everything, to turn it into a rational decision. But emotional truth always returned stronger. What if I had stopped? Was the question cutting through every attempt at distraction. Understood too late that he didn't need certainty to act with empathy. He only needed to act. Ignored compassion turned into daily self-demand. The love he didn't offer in that moment now manifested as absence. Henry began to realize that some consequences don't come as external punishment, but as a silent shift in the way one exists. As a mentor, observing this transformation, it's clear that the greatest consequence of a wrong decision isn't what happens outside, but what breaks inside. Henry started seeing himself differently in the mirrorless hole, less aligned with the image he had of himself. Internal reconciliation felt distant. He wasn't a villain, but he could no longer see himself as fully intact. Wisdom arrived, but it arrived heavy. The kindness missing that day was now missing every day. And as he tried to live with this new version of himself, something in his behavior began to change, signaling that this guilt wouldn't to remain internal. It would start shaping his next actions in deep and perhaps unbalanced ways. As weeks passed, Henry Turner was no longer the same man rushing distractedly through city streets. Something in him had shifted, like a misaligned piece preventing the whole from functioning properly. The wrong decision stopped being an isolated event and became an internal landmark, a silent reference point for every subsequent choice. He began to observe more, hesitate more, distrust his own reactions. Every situation asking for help triggered exaggerated alertness, as if life were constantly testing him. Empathy, once spontaneous, now came loaded with fear. The weight on his conscience shaped how he saw the world. Henry lived divided between emotional decision and rational decision, trusting neither completely. When he saw someone in need, his body wanted to act immediately, but his mind froze, revisiting the past. The result was paralysis. The past poorly made choice created new flawed choices in the present. He lost naturalness, that lightness, born from acting in alignment with one's values. Compassion became internal obligation, not genuine impulse. Love that should flow became demand. Regret didn't automatically make him better, just more cautious, heavier. The cruelest consequence of this transformation was realizing the mistake. Hadn't he stayed in the past, it interfered with the present. With bitter wisdom, Henry understood that some wrong decisions don't teach immediately. They disorganize. Reconciliation with himself felt distant because he no longer knew who he was trying to be. Kindness, when it appeared, came mixed with anxiety. The power of goodness still existed, but now had to push through layers of fear and guilt. And as Henry tried to adjust to this new version of himself, life began to demand payment in an even more sensitive territory where choices directly affect those who walk beside us. People close to Henry Turner began noticing something was different. Even without knowing exactly what, he was physically present, but emotionally distant, like someone carrying a thought too heavy to share. Simple conversations grew shorter, laughter rarer, silences more frequent. The wrong decision, made alone on some random sidewalk, now echoed at home, at work, in friendships. The weight on his conscience no longer stayed confined to solitude. It infiltrated relationships, creating an invisible barrier. The empathy he denied the boy now, unintentionally, was missing for those beside him. Small conflicts arose without clear cause. Henry became impatient, defensive, sometimes overly serious. The past poorly made choice left its mark on the present, because regret consumes emotional energy. He wanted to be kind, but was exhausted. He wanted to listen, but his mind was stuck, replaying the same scene. Compassion, when not practiced, doesn't disappear. Returns as internal pressure. Those close to him felt the change, even if they couldn't trace its origin. Love was still there, but crossed with guilt and tension, making everything harder. From the standpoint of wisdom, it's clear how individual decisions never remain individual for long. Henry began to understand, belatedly, that every choice carries a domino effect. The rational decision to move on that day now showed its collective emotional cost. Reconciliation with others first required internal reconciliation he hadn't yet achieved. Kindness became conscious effort, not natural reflex. And as his relationships adjusted to this new version of him, Henry felt he needed to do anything to ease that weight. Unaware he was about to seek a solution that, though well-intentioned, came from the wrong place. Over time, Henry Turner's relationships began to crumble quietly but steadily. Arguments emerged over small, almost insignificant matters, yet loaded with disproportionate tension. A sharp comment, a minor delay. A common oversight became sparks. The weight on his conscience made Henry more reactive, less tolerant, as if every question were a threat. The wrong decision from days earlier now appeared in harsh words spoken without conscious intent. The empathy missing on that sidewalk seemed now missing at home, at work, among close friends. People around Henry began feeling rejected without understanding why. He listened less, explained less, closed himself off more. The poorly made choice turned into emotional distance. Arguments ended unresolved, leaving only heavy silence. Regret made him too introspective to open up, and too proud to admit what truly gnawed at him inside. The compassion he still had for others was suffocated by a constant self-judgment. Lau remained, but accompanied by irritation and impatience, creating emotional confusion for those who tried to get close. From the perspective of wisdom, it's impossible to ignore how unresolved errors spill over onto innocent relationships. Henry realized his rational decision to move on had created a chain of poorly digested emotional decisions. Kindness became rare, replaced by automatic responses. Reconciliation with others grew harder because he couldn't forgive himself. The power of goodness still existed within him, but lay buried under guilt and frustration. And as conflicts accumulated, Henry felt an almost desperate urgency to compensate for the past, unaware that this attempt at repair would lead him into an even greater imbalance. Conflicts in Henry Turner's life stopped being temporary tensions and became concrete ruptures. Old friendships drifted away, first fewer messages, then definitive silence. At home, discussions took on a heavier, warier tone, as if everyone were exhausted from trying to understand someone no longer reachable. The wrong decision from that distant day kept charging high emotional interest. The weight on his conscience made Henry less available, less affectionate, less present. Empathy, once sustaining his bonds, was swallowed by constant regret, creating a void hard to explain. In a particularly painful moment, Henry heard something unexpected. Someone close told him he had changed too much, that he seemed like a different person, colder, distant, almost unrecognizable. The words cut cleanly. The poorly made choice hadn't only affected his inner peace, it had reshaped how the world saw him. Trying to respond, he began helping excessively, saying yes to everything, putting himself in situations beyond his limits. It was a desperate attempt to balance an invisible scale. Helping ceased to be love and became penance. Every good deed carried the silent expectation of easing the weight on his conscience. From the standpoint of wisdom, this phase revealed a harsh truth. Compensating is not the same as repairing. Henry confused emotional decision with redemption. Kindness, born of guilt, rarely heals it, merely disguises the wound. The power of goodness remained, but was being used as self-punishment. True reconciliation would require what he still avoided: facing the error without trying to erase it through excess. Some opportunities don't return. Some encounters are unique, and as Henry exhausted himself, trying to fix the past with excessive actions in the present, he began to understand with pain and maturity that certain marks don't disappear, they teach, preparing him to accept that this decision would leave a permanent imprint on who he would become. Over time, consequences moved beyond emotion and struck the core structures of Henry Turner's life. At work, his declining performance became visible. Focus faltered, simple decisions took too long, and former confidence gave way to constant insecurity. An important opportunity for professional growth slipped through his fingers when he hesitated too much, fearing another mistake. Leadership interpreted his posture as disinterest. Henry knew that wasn't it, but couldn't explain. The past wrong decision kept shaping the present. The weight on his conscience now demanded stability, purpose, direction. Regret didn't just hurt, it cost dearly. In his personal life, the hardest loss was silent and final. An important relationship ended without dramatic explosions, just a tired realization that something had broken beyond repair. Henry heard that he was no longer truly there, that he had become absent while present. The words became an internal scar. The past poorly made choice had eroded his ability to fully connect. The love he felt couldn't cross the wall of guilt. The compassion he offered others came too late for himself. Reconciliation felt impossible, not for lack of desire, but because some pains don't accept shortcuts. With suffering forced to maturity, Henry finally grasped something essential. The wrong decision didn't make him a bad person, but it changed him forever. The wisdom gained came with loss, not victory. He learned that rational decision without empathy is empty calculation. An emotional decision without courage becomes omission. The power of goodness revealed its harshest. Face the one that teaches through what wasn't done. The kindness missing that day became a daily reminder. The boy on the sidewalk never appeared again, but his absence remained a constant presence, not as divine punishment, but as living memory that some choices, though small, leave eternal marks. And Henry went on living, knowing that was the decision that changed everything.
After following this story, the question isn't about Henry Turner. It's about you. How many times has life placed someone in your path asking for attention, empathy, a simple act of kindness, and you answered with haste, silence, or indifference? How many emotional decisions have you labeled as rational decisions just to ease the moment, without imagining the weight on the conscience that could come later? The heaviest regret doesn't come from the obvious mistake, but from the poorly made choice that seems too small to trend. But that's exactly why it cuts so deep. This story isn't meant to accuse, but to awaken understanding. You can't change past decisions, but you can transform the next ones. The power of goodness lives in simple actions. And the minute you choose to stop, listen, help, act, true wisdom is born when you understand that every choice shapes who you become. So I ask you, with respect and love, What decision are you postponing today that could completely change your tomorrow? What would you do differently if you knew this seemingly ordinary moment could become a turning point? If this story moved you, if it stirred emotion, inspiration, or even discomfort, don't ignore it. Use that feeling as fuel to live with more compassion, affection, and awareness. And if you want to keep learning about choices, human behavior, and real transformation, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications. Here, every story exists to help you live with more clarity, more forgiveness, and more humanity, because decisions pass, but who you become remains.